Hey guys, I'm always happy to reply to letters from my supporters on Patreon. As I've been reflecting lately, I think you guys get a lot of entertainment for $1 a month, especially if you're interested in veganism. Be hilarious to know if anyone's subscribing who's not interested in talking about veganism. I have a letter here from a guy named Jackson. Jackson writes, "First off, thanks for all your interesting content. I'm glad that I'm a latecomer to your channel because I get to go back through your entire catalog of videos. So I do have some fans who have watched every single one of my 400 plus videos. Small number of people. And I think that those people probably know me better than they know some of their own blood relations or some of their personal friends they may have gone to high school with, or people who they met in college. That's a lot of hours of hearing my voice if you've watched every single video I've ever recorded. But anyway, welcome to the club, Jackson, and thank you for pitching $1 a month so you can interact with this way on Patreon. So Jackson writes, I'm a 23-year-old vegan living in Canberra. I study philosophy, political science, and anthropology. I am particularly interested in human-animal relations in an anthropological context and an ethical context. I am interested in vegan politics, and I also have an interest in Buddhist philosophy. We seem to share quite a few interests. So I pause there. I am not an anthropologist. However, I have been referred to in print as an anthropologist. That happened for the first time when I was living in Laos. Some of my research interests come very close to anthropology. Some of my own studies, both in terms of formal academia and informal publications, definitely overlap with anthropology. Anthropology has been a significant part of my adult life. But political science is what my first university diploma was in. Philosophy has been a huge part of my life at every stage of my life, Western philosophy as well as Buddhist philosophy. I was a scholar of Buddhism for more than 10 years. And the bad news is, if we have a common interest in Buddhist philosophy, Jackson, there's absolutely nothing worth reading in the English language. My own articles published in English are okay. Only a couple of them, you can read them. But those articles will try to explain to you just how profound the problems of language and bias are. And really, I cannot recommend at all reading anything about Buddhist philosophy in English, because what's available in English is garbage. End of digression. Back to Jackson's letter here. Jackson writes, one of the cornerstones of cultural anthropology is cultural relativism, at least in theory. A contentious statement, but we continue. How do you navigate cross-cultural moral judgments about ecology, politics, ethics, and so on? Is it possible to do so? How can veganism meaningfully penetrate other cultures? Hey, let's pause. How can it meaningfully penetrate any culture? Like, what we're going to talk about this as if it's already penetrated the culture in Australia or England or Canada. Boy, I think we may be at a big disadvantage in Western culture compared to some Asian cultures today. He says, I have heard your account of meeting vegans in Taiwan, which I found very interesting. Indeed, Taiwan's a fascinating case study. Israel also is probably a fascinating case study, but I don't know that much about Israel. If veganism, as we in the West understand it, can meaningfully cross into another culture, does this reveal anything about human nature? Thanks for your time. I look forward to your response, Jackson. End of message. Thank you, Jackson. It's a great letter, and I'm really happy to reply to it. I'm happy anyone who's supporting me on Patreon, write in, and I'm really happy to make these videos replying to your questions, comments, controversies, or what have you. So Jackson approaches this question in terms of cultural relativism, and my response is relatively succinct because I do not. So Jackson has a background not only in anthropology, but also in political science. So I deal with this in a political science manner, and I address it under the heading of minimum standards. Why do I use the term minimum standards? Because it is much more simple, clear, and concise than invoking the complex jargon and political baggage of the concept of human rights, or the complex jargon and baggage of animal rights. Minimum standards. This can also be expressed in terms of requirements. If a country like Saudi Arabia wants to participate in the Olympics, an international event, they face a set of requirements. In Saudi Arabia, women do not have the basic freedoms that you may take for granted in your country, such as wearing a bathing suit, such as being able to practice swimming in public, in a public swimming pool, right? This actually becomes a problem when a country like Saudi Arabia tries to meet the minimum requirements to participate in the Olympics or the Commonwealth Games or other international games that actually do have rules and regulations requiring gender equality, parity, equal government support for sports that are done by both men and women. Now, Western countries also run into problems with these requirements because a Western country, for example, may just not support women's boxing or women's football or women's soccer. There may just be some sports that are really unpopular in the country where female athletes don't get much support, and then they run into roadblocks where these international foundations say, no, wait, we actually have provisions and guidelines here. You have to meet certain standards of supporting women's athleticism also under these various headings. It's not complete parity. It's not that you have to have an exactly equal number of women swimming and men swimming, but there are requirements. Now, again, this is much more precise than talking about human rights. You talk about human rights to swim. It's a bit abstract. Yes, women have the right to swim in Saudi Arabia, but how they can actually exercise that right, what that actually means, this is a case of requirements. When we talk about a minimum standard they have to meet if they want to participate in that international event, it's very clear what we mean. It's also clear that we're not endorsing war as a way of changing Saudi Arabia's culture. It's just a requirement. Either they can isolate themselves or they can meet those requirements and join that forum. Now, in economic matters, this type of requirement-based reasoning is extremely powerful. If you have an international trade dispute committee, and you can only join that committee, you can only join that international foundation if your country meets a bunch of requirements. So this happened with China. Even more recently happened with Vietnam. So Vietnam wanted to join trade organizations, international cooperation organizations, development organizations, and in order to join, they had to, in effect, bring about certain types of human rights. They had to meet certain minimum standards, right? Now, again, no one was threatening to invade Vietnam. No one was threatening to bomb Vietnam. The United States has quite a spectacular history of invading and bombing Vietnam. You may have heard of it. But in the last couple of decades, since the 1990s, no one was considering the option of using violent coercion to force Vietnam to live up to those standards. But the standards exist, and you say, if you want to sit at this round table, if you want to participate in this international foundation organization, here are the standards you have to meet. Now, I mean, this line of reasoning, which I say is really kind of hard brass tacks political science and has nothing to do with cultural relativism. We've completely evaded the issue of cultural relativism, which you raise. It's a good question. But my answer, I think, deals with the heart of the matter while totally evading all of those problems. You could have something similar like this. The production of alcohol and cigarettes are very tightly regulated that way internationally, where people say, look, if you want to sell cigarettes in our country, if you want to be able to import and export cigarettes, if you want to be able to sell alcohol in our country, there are a whole bunch of requirements you have to meet for what can and can't be used in cigarettes, what can and can't be used in alcohol. Now, this may seem like a ridiculous comparison, but it's not. Step by step, it is definitely true that the type of ethical concerns vegans have can be brought to bear on leather and milk and meat, what's in our diet, and the other products and the exploitation of animals, the handling of animals that are bought and sold to be tortured to death in laboratories for medical research, for vivisection. All of those issues actually can be addressed in this sense under the heading of minimum standards of requirements. Here's what you need to do to be able to access this market, to be able to participate in this forum, or what have you. Does cultural relativism still matter? Yes. When I first opened my Patreon, I had a number of very devout Muslim members join my Patreon. I don't know if they've quit. I don't know if they've quit because I talk too much about my sex life or what have you. I mean, I don't know. I haven't, pardon me, I haven't heard from the members in a while. But they were serious, believing Muslims who were trying to promote veganism within the Muslim world, within North Africa, or the ones I remember more, Muslim North Africa. The challenge of approaching and explaining and expressing veganism as a movement, as a moral mandate, as a paradigm in a Muslim context is much, much more challenging than pursuing it and expressing it here in China. I currently live in Kunming, China, or in Thailand, or in Sri Lanka. In Sri Lanka, I had a blog entry about this. There was a Buddhist monk who actually committed suicide in spectacular fashion, because he was really the only monk at that time trying to lead a political movement in Sri Lanka against the slaughtering of cows and other large mammals. Now, obviously, if you're many vegans will object to the speciesism. They'll say, why are you just trying to object to cows and not dogs or whatever? But all right, let's leave that aside here. He lit himself on fire and burned himself to death, as I recall. I may be misremembering, but he committed suicide publicly. I guess giving up on the fact that he was in this devoutly Buddhist country, majority Buddhist country, Sri Lanka, but nobody cared. And everyone in that Buddhist country was living with the hypocrisy of being a member of a religion that says you shouldn't hurt a fly, you shouldn't kill mice, you shouldn't, you know what I mean? You should minimize violence towards animals of all kind, and yet everyone around you, one way or another, is buying meat. And yes, you meet some Buddhists who buy chicken but won't buy cow, or who buy fish but won't buy pork. But veganism is almost non-existent in Theravada countries. It's a new idea. It's not an ancient traditional part. And Theravada Buddhism has been incredibly weak in support for even just vegetarianism. So, I sympathize. However, as desperate and hopeless as that may sound, a Buddhist monk committing suicide for the concept of veganism or concept of caring about cows being slaughtered, in a Muslim cultural context, can we even imagine a parallel? The struggle is so far off, and the basic understanding of the concept is so far removed. I think that many of these Asian cultures that have a history connected to Buddhism and Taoism have many advantages over the Western world. And on the other hand, there are disadvantages. The one I really feel most keenly here in China is access to the type of information that Vegan Gains features all the time. Vegan Gains is all the time promoting information about health science. And he's able to very rapidly get on the internet, look at a bunch of articles, and come to conclusions about cancer and heart attacks and your health and how it's connected to veganism. The English language is very, very powerful for accessing that kind of health information and putting together a cogent argument. If your first language is Thai, if your first language is Sinhalese, if your first language is Burmese, very, very hard to get up that ledge. So, but again, this is not an issue of cultural relativism. I'm just saying they have some advantages in these cultures in terms of just having the concept that killing animals matters. I think they have advantages in terms of conceptualizing ecology, responsibility for the state of the world. So I think there are many advantages. But in terms of the progress of science and the way science may or may not be able to dynamically contribute to our own nascent movement here in veganism, they're at a disadvantage. And in large part, they are dependent on English translation. And that's true even when you meet scientists from Germany. They'll all tell you right away that even if your first language is German, you rely on English language publications. German is also a very affluent language and has its own publications. So this is not unique to Asia. So that's my answer to your question, Jackson. I do appreciate cultural anthropology. It's been a significant part of my adult life, as well as, of course, political science and philosophy. However, I actually approach these issues with a totally different attitude and set of considerations that I phrase in terms of minimum standards and requirements, and I do not, and thus in this way I eschew this problem of cultural relativism.